I wasn't asking out of excitement, I was asking because a mother should know. I smiled softly and said, "So, when is the wedding?" She didn't look surprised. She didn't hesitate. She said calmly, "We got married yesterday." The room went quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that rings in your ears. Yesterday? Yesterday. And no one thought to tell me? I stood there, still smiling, because sometimes shock doesn't let you cry right away. I replayed her words again and again. Yesterday, not tomorrow, not next week. Yesterday meant I wasn't invited, I wasn't informed, I wasn't needed, and suddenly I understood something painful. This wedding wasn't kept secret. I was. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask where, because asking would have made it worse. I nodded politely, like a guest who arrived too late to a life she was never meant to attend. I raised my son. I gave my years, my strength, my silence. But when his new life began, I wasn't part of the beginning. Some pains don't come with shouting. They arrive gently, wrapped in polite words. That day I learned something heavy. Sometimes you don't lose people in arguments. You lose them in announcements you never receive. I didn't cry that day, but something inside me understood. I was no longer family. I was just someone who found out too late. I stood there, still holding the counter, still breathing, still alive, but suddenly unsure of where I stood in their world. I felt like I had stepped into a room halfway through a conversation and realized it had been going on for a long time without me. Yesterday, I didn't ask where it happened. I didn't ask who was there. I didn't ask why I wasn't told. Not because I didn't want answers, because I already had one. She finally looked up from her phone then, just for a second. Her expression wasn't cruel. It wasn't warm either. It was neutral, like she was talking about the weather, like she had just told me what time the store closed. I nodded again. I let it slide. That's what women like me do. We let things slide because making a scene feels worse than swallowing the hurt. Because dignity teaches you to stay quiet, even when your chest feels too tight. I turned back toward the sink. The dishes were already clean, but I rinsed them anyway. Water ran over my hands, warm and steady, giving me something to focus on. I watched it flow like it could carry the moment away with it. Yesterday. I thought about the word while the water ran, about how many yesterdays I had given to my son, about school mornings, late dinners, scraped knees, quiet prayers I said when no one was watching. I thought about how I had always believed those things counted for something. I guess I was wrong. She said something else after that. I don't remember what it was. Something small. Something ordinary. The kind of thing people say when they think the important part is already over. But for me, the important part had just begun. That was the moment I realized I wasn't in the loop anymore. Not invited, not informed, not considered. And the worst part? No one thought it needed an explanation. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say a word that could be used against me later. I just stood there, letting the water run, letting the moment pass, like it expected me to. Yesterday. Some words don't echo, they sink, and that one sank deep. After she said it, nothing changed. That's what hurt the most. The kitchen didn't freeze. The clock didn't stop ticking. The world didn't pause to acknowledge what had just been taken from me. She went back to her phone. The kettle cooled down on its own. Life kept moving like my absence from their moment wasn't worth slowing down for. I stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, just to prove to myself that I still belonged in the room. My body was there. My shadow was still on the floor. But emotionally, I already felt like I'd been gently pushed outside a door no one planned to open again. Yesterday. I kept saying it in my head like if I repeated it enough, it might start making sense. Yesterday meant vows. Yesterday meant pictures. Yesterday meant witnesses. Yesterday meant a moment people usually share with family. I wasn't there. And the truth settled in slowly, not like a knife, but like weight, the kind that presses down on your chest without warning, making it harder to breathe even though you're not panicking. I took a slow breath in, then another. I didn't want anyone to notice. I've learned over the years that when you're the older one, people expect you to be fine. They expect you to understand, to be flexible, to accept whatever version of the story you're handed, even if your name is missing from it. So I told myself to stay calm. I wiped my hands on a dish towel that didn't need drying, folded it neatly, placed it back where it belonged. Small, careful movements, the kind that keep you grounded when your thoughts start drifting somewhere dangerous. I thought about saying something light, a joke maybe, something like, well, that was quick. But the words didn't feel right in my mouth. Humour needs air, and suddenly the room felt too tight for that. Instead, I stayed quiet. Silence has always been my way of protecting myself. When you don't react, people can't accuse you of overreacting. When you don't ask questions, no one has to justify their answers. She didn't ask if I was okay. That detail stuck with me longer than I expected. Not because I needed comfort, but because it confirmed something I was trying not to admit. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was a choice that had already been made, and I was finding out after the fact. Yesterday. I walked to the window and looked outside. The yard looked the same as it always did. A little uneven, leaves scattered where they didn't belong. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary. That felt fitting. Big changes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they slip into your life quietly, disguised as casual conversations in familiar kitchens. I wondered how long they had planned it. Weeks? Months? Long enough to decide I didn't need to know. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. Anger is loud, obvious, easy to point at. What I felt was heavier, quieter, like disappointment that had aged into something deeper, something that doesn't ask for apologies anymore. I thought about all the times I had stepped back to give them space, all the times I told myself, don't interfere, don't overstep, let them live. I believed respect would keep me close. I guess distance has a way of becoming permanent when no one checks how far it's gone. She finally spoke again, breaking the silence with something casual. I don't remember her exact words, just the tone. Normal, unbothered. Like this conversation would blend into the rest of the day without leaving a mark. I responded the same way. Normal, polite, controlled. That's the thing about moments like these. You don't fall apart right away. You hold yourself together because that's what you've always done. You save the unraveling for later, when no one's watching. Yesterday. I didn't ask for details. I didn't ask for pictures. I didn't ask to be included after the fact, because deep down I knew it wouldn't change anything. Some doors close so quietly, you don't realize you're locked out until you're already standing alone on the other side. I didn't realize it all at once. That kind of truth doesn't rush you. It waits until you're alone enough to hear it. Later that evening, after the kitchen lights were off and the house settled into its usual creaks and sighs, I sat in the living room with only a small lamp on. The couch felt too big, like it was built for conversations that weren't happening anymore. I sat on the edge, hands folded in my lap, posture straight out of habit. That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't forgetfulness. People forget appointments. They forget groceries. They forget to return calls. They don't forget weddings, especially not their own. I thought back to the way she'd said it. We got married yesterday. No hesitation. No awkward pause. No apology waiting behind the words. That kind of confidence only comes when someone knows they won't be questioned. And I hadn't questioned her. Not because I was afraid, but because somewhere inside me, I already knew the answer. I wasn't included because I wasn't meant to be. That realization didn't sting. It settled, like dust after something breaks. I looked around the living room. Everything was where it always had been. The framed photos, the throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of the chair. A room full of memories that suddenly felt archived, like I was sitting in a museum of a life I used to actively live. I remembered when my son used to sit right there, shoes kicked off, talking about nothing important. I remembered how he used to ask my opinion, even on small things: what to eat, where to go, what made sense. Somewhere along the way that stopped. Not abruptly, not with an argument, just quietly. I wondered when they decided I didn't need to know, whether it was a long conversation or a quick agreement, whether my name came up at all, or if it was easier to leave me out entirely. That thought sat heavy with me, because being excluded hurts less than being discussed and dismissed. I leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. The light cast soft shadows above me, familiar shapes I'd seen 1,000 times. Familiarity can be comforting, but that night, it just reminded me how unchanged my world was compared to theirs. They had moved forward. I had stayed still. And that's when it really hit me. This wasn't about the wedding. The wedding was just proof. Proof that a new circle had formed, and I was standing outside it, close enough to see in, too far to step inside. I thought about all the times I had stepped back deliberately, all the times I told myself not to interfere, not to hover, not to be that mother. I had believed distance was respect, but respect doesn't mean erasing someone. I realized then that I had been shrinking myself without noticing, speaking less, asking less, expecting less, slowly adjusting to a version of life where my presence was optional. And yesterday confirmed it. No invitation, no phone call, no message that said, "We wanted you to know." Just an announcement delivered after the fact, like an update I didn't subscribe to. I didn't feel bitter. That surprised me again. What I felt was clarity. A calm, painful understanding that something had shifted. And it wasn't coming back. Relationships don't always end with goodbyes. Sometimes they just stop including you in the future. I sat there a long time listening to the house, the refrigerator humming, the faint sound of a car passing outside. Normal sounds, ordinary life. All of it continuing, just like it had earlier in the kitchen. I finally stood up and turned off the lamp. As the room went dark, I thought to myself, this is what it feels like to be left out without being pushed away. No confrontation, no explanation, just silence that answers every question you didn't ask. I used to be needed. That thought came to me the next morning, quietly, the way memories do when they don't want to be interrupted. I was sitting at the small table by the window, the one where the sunlight lands first. Coffee in my hands. No rush to be anywhere. No one waiting on me. There was a time when mornings didn't belong to me. Back then, I woke up before the sun, every day feeling like the clock was already ahead of me. Lunches to pack, clothes to find, shoes that somehow always went missing at the last minute. My son used to sit at the table half awake, hair a mess, asking questions about the world like I had all the answers. I didn't, but I tried anyway. I remember tying his shoes while he leaned against the wall, impatient but trusting. I remember the weight of his backpack on my shoulder when he was too small to carry it himself. I remember standing at doors, school doors, hospital doors, practice doors, waiting until I knew he was safe on the other side. That was my role. I didn't announce it. I didn't demand credit for it. I just showed up. And I believed, maybe foolishly, that showing up meant something permanent, that being there at the beginning earned you a place later on. Yesterday challenged that belief. I took a sip of my coffee and stared out the window. The street looked ordinary. Neighbours going about their lives, cars pulling out of driveways, everyone moving forward in their own direction. I thought about how carefully I had stepped back as my son grew older, How I learned to keep my opinions to myself unless asked. How I stopped calling so often. How I convinced myself that space was healthy, that independence was a good thing. I wanted him to build his own life. I just didn't expect to be excluded from it. I remembered the first time he brought her home. I had tried to be welcoming, calm, respectful. I didn't pry. I didn't hover. I told myself, don't make this about you. I believed that kindness would protect my place. Looking back, I realize something now. Kindness doesn't always translate to inclusion. Sometimes it teaches people that you won't push back. I sat there longer than I meant to, letting the past play softly in my mind. The version of me who was always in demand felt distant now, like someone I once knew well but hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't feel sorry for myself. That surprised me too. What I felt was a kind of grief that doesn't cry. A grief that stands straight and keeps its voice steady. The kind that says, this mattered to me, even if no one else noticed. I stood up and rinsed my cup. The routine felt grounding, familiar. I folded the dish towel carefully the same way I always had. Some habits stay with you, even when the people you built them for move on. I thought about the wedding again, not the event itself, but what it represented. A beginning I wasn't part of. A chapter written without my name in it. I wondered if they thought I wouldn't mind. If they assumed I'd understand. Older women are expected to be understanding, expected to accept change quietly, to step aside gracefully. I suppose that's what I did. But understanding doesn't erase hurt. It just teaches you how to carry it without dropping it. I walked back to the window and watched the light shift across the floor. Time keeps moving whether you're ready or not, whether you're included or not. I realized then that who I used to be still mattered to me. Even if my role had changed, even if my place felt uncertain, I wasn't invisible. I was just no longer needed in the same way. And maybe that's what hurt the most. The house was the same. Same walls, same furniture, same creaking stairs. Same faint smell of old wood and lemon cleaner. Same clock ticking over the living room fireplace. And yet, it wasn't. Walking through it that evening, every step echoed differently. Not because the floors had changed, they hadn't, but because the life that had once filled the space had shifted. The laughter that used to bounce off the walls now existed only in memory. The chatter of someone asking questions, telling stories, making ordinary moments feel alive, was gone. Yesterday's wedding had made a quiet announcement. I was no longer part of the everyday hum of their lives. I ran my hand along the banister, feeling the familiar grooves of the wood beneath my fingers. My touch lingered longer than it used to. Maybe I was hoping some warmth would remain. Maybe I was hoping some presence of theirs would still echo here, in this place I had called home for decades. It didn't. The living room felt different too. The couch I sat on every evening now seemed wider. The cushions didn't welcome me. They reminded me of empty space. The framed photos on the wall, the ones of family holidays, birthdays, quiet mornings, and proud milestones, stared back like silent witnesses. Witnesses to a life that had continued without me. I walked into the kitchen next. The kettle, the small wooden table, the spice rack lined up neatly against the wall. They were unchanged, but the air felt heavier, quieter. The space between things suddenly mattered. The gap between chairs, the distance from the counter to the sink, the emptiness where laughter used to live. All of it pressed in, subtle but insistent. I sat at the table tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. The circular motion felt familiar, comforting, routine. It reminded me that some things were still mine. But even as I held the cup, I felt the absence around me. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was observing, like the house itself knew something had shifted and was letting me understand it in the only way it could. by making me notice. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately. Every room told a story, every corner whispered the same truth. Yesterday had happened, and I had not been part of it. The bedrooms, once full of chatter and warmth, now seemed untouched by presence. Even the small hallway mirror reflected my solitary figure with a kind of honesty that was hard to ignore. I thought about how the rooms would look when they returned. She, him, the new energy they brought. I'd be here, a quiet observer in the background, not unwelcome, but not noticed, not part of the rhythm they now kept together. I didn't feel resentment. I didn't feel anger. That's not how these things settle in older hearts. What I felt was awareness, a sober, steady realization that my world had changed, that yesterday had shifted the furniture of my life in a way that no dusting, no rearranging could undo. And yet, there was dignity in it. I wasn't going to cry out. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to try to force my presence into a space that no longer had room for it. I would exist quietly, faithfully, in the corners and edges that remained mine. I would observe. I would remember. I would continue. Because even when the house feels different, and the rooms echo with absence, some things cannot be taken away. The years I invested, the lessons I taught, the life I lived, the love I gave. I walked back to the living room and sat by the lamp, letting the light spill across the floor. My eyes traced the furniture, the walls, the familiar shadows. I breathed slowly. I let the silence sink in, naming it, acknowledging it, accepting it. Yesterday had changed the house. Yesterday had shifted my place in it. But I was still here, still present, still dignified. The quiet isn't always easy, but it is honest. And honesty, I realized, is sometimes stronger than noise. I learned early that silence can be louder than words. Not the kind that fills a room with tension, not the kind that demands attention, the kind that teaches you how to carry yourself without needing anyone's approval. After yesterday, the house reminded me of that lesson again. Every corner, every chair, every shadow whispered it. I was here, but I wasn't part of the moment that mattered most, and yelling or complaining wouldn't change that. It never did. I remember standing by the window again, watching a neighbour's dog run across their yard, carefree and unbothered. The sun was soft that morning, warming my face through the glass. I breathed slowly, tracing the pattern of light on the floor. Quiet can be a form of resistance. It can also be a form of grace. I chose both. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look for explanations that weren't coming. The world had moved forward, and I had to learn how to move alongside it without forcing myself into a space where I wasn't wanted. It wasn't easy. Every habit I had built around being seen, being needed, being part of the life I helped shape, demanded attention. My son's laughter, the chatter of family meals, the small daily routines, all of it existed somewhere else now, and I was left with fragments and echoes. I started small. I would sit at the table and drink my tea slowly, savouring the warmth that reminded me of my own care. I would fold laundry, each piece neatly placed, not for anyone to admire, but because the act itself grounded me. I would water the plants, watch them grow, and let their steady pace remind me that life continues, even when it excludes you. Silence became a companion. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of observation. I listened more. I noticed details I had once overlooked, the way light falls on the wall in the late afternoon, the subtle creak in the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Small things, mundane things, became markers of my continued existence. I didn't feel lonely in the way others might think. Loneliness is often pictured as loud, desperate, painful. Mine was quieter, more contained, dignified. I acknowledged it without letting it control me. I let it sit beside me like a shadow, familiar and constant, reminding me that I was still alive, still capable of care, still deserving of space in the world, even if that space had shrunk. I thought about confrontation. I thought about questions, about asking why, demanding inclusion, expressing disappointment. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that these things were a form of participation in a story I no longer had the right to edit. My role now was observer, witness, keeper of the past. And that role, I decided, was enough. I spent the afternoon moving through the house in quiet meditation, touching surfaces with gentle hands, arranging things with care, noticing the small imperfections that reminded me the world wasn't perfect. And that was okay. I whispered to myself occasionally, not out of fear or sadness, but out of acknowledgement. I am here. I am still here. The lesson of yesterday, the lesson of the wedding, was simple. Some doors close and no amount of knocking will open them again. Some chapters start without you, and no amount of pleading will rewrite them. The dignity of remaining quiet, of existing with awareness, of carrying your own presence without relying on recognition, this was the lesson I embraced. And as I moved through my day, completing ordinary tasks with calm precision, I felt something unexpected. Strength. Not loud, not heroic, not celebrated. Just quiet, steady strength. Strength that comes from knowing your worth isn't defined by the attention of others, by invitations, by inclusion. It comes from knowing you can exist fully, with grace, even in absence. Yesterday had changed a lot, but it hadn't taken that from me. I learned to smile quietly at memories, to nod internally at moments that would never include me, to exist without disturbance. And in that quiet, in that slow, unacknowledged life, I found a sense of control I hadn't realized I still had. Silence can be heavy. Silence can be lonely. But silence, I discovered, can also be a kind of dignity. And dignity, I decided, is stronger than noise. Evenings are quiet now. The house hums with the usual sounds, refrigerator, occasional car passing outside, the soft creak of floorboards. But there is a weight in it I notice more than I used to. A stillness that carries yesterday forward, like it's stretched across the walls, lingering in the corners, filling spaces I thought belonged to me. I sit in my favourite chair, the one by the window, watching shadows stretch across the floor. Sometimes I imagine him walking in, smiling, ready to tell me about his day. Sometimes I imagine her standing nearby, chatting about plans, updates, trivial things that suddenly feel monumental because I wasn't part of them. And then I remember, yesterday happened, and I wasn't there. I do not dwell on anger. I do not rehearse arguments in my head. That would change nothing. It would only make my quiet life heavier. Instead, I let my mind drift through memories, the small, everyday moments that once defined my place in their world. I remember him as a child, laughing in the morning light, needing guidance, needing care. I remember the careful routines, the whispered advice, the way love had been expressed in subtle, patient ways. Those days are gone. And yet, I exist. I breathe. I move through my home. I notice. I acknowledge. I allow the moments to pass without demanding recognition. Some nights I wonder if they even remember. If she notices that the space between us carries weight, unspoken and unresolved. If he reflects on the years we shared, the quiet sacrifices made in the background, the guidance given without expectation of reward. I do not know. Perhaps they do not think of it at all. And perhaps that is the point. Yesterday shifted more than a day. It shifted perspective. It drew boundaries I had always assumed would not exist. It reminded me that some doors close quietly, without announcement, without confrontation. And when they do, all that is left is the choice of how to respond. I have chosen quiet. Quiet is not empty. Quiet is deliberate. Quiet is strength. It carries dignity because it is chosen, not imposed. It carries awareness because it reflects understanding. And it carries resilience because it refuses to let absence define worth. I am still part of my story, not the part they wrote yesterday, not the chapter they opened without me, but I am here, I exist, I remember, I breathe, and maybe that is enough. I do not ask for explanations, I do not demand inclusion. I allow myself to feel the sting without letting it shape my actions. I observe, I reflect, I continue. Sometimes I imagine a future where words are spoken, where acknowledgement arrives late but still matters. Sometimes I imagine that they will realize, in their own way, that yesterday left a quiet scar. And maybe, just maybe, it will prompt reflection. But whether it does or not does not change the truth I hold. Dignity is not contingent on recognition. Presence is not validated by invitations. Strength is measured by how quietly one stands when no one notices. I do not cry. I do not plead. I simply exist in my home, a witness to what has changed and what remains. Some days that is heavy. Some days it is liberating. I know the world will continue. The house will remain. The sunlight will still cast patterns on the floor. Life will move forward with or without me in certain moments. And that is reality I accept. I do not have answers to the questions left hanging in yesterday's air. I do not know if my son or daughter-in-law will consider me when they speak of that day. I do not know if the silence will ever be broken, or if acknowledgement will arrive late, or not at all. But I do know this. I am here. I remember. I breathe. I remain. And perhaps that is the truest answer to exclusion.